The Big Orange Splot by Daniel Manus Pinkwater is a very funny children's book, which is also a good metaphor for creativity and individualism. The childlike quality of the illustrations and the narrator's voice work together to make this book feel most effective when read aloud with an emerging reader. The protagonist, Mr. Plumbean, sporting a handsome mustache and unwavering gaze, lives on a street where all the houses are the same, and he likes things the way they are. This establishes his normal way of life before the inciting incident, the Big Orange Splot, changing his life. The narrator uses conversation to help cue the reader to this book's sense of humor. The page reads, "A seagull flew over Mr. Plumbean's house. He was carrying a can of bright orange paint," and added in parentheses, "no one knows why." I think this works comedically because it stimulates conversation between the parent and the emerging reader. It's letting us know that the book is aware of how strange this is. Mr. Plumbean converses with his neighbors in a comedically brusque way about the Big Orange Splot, but to their surprise, he doesn't get around to painting it over right away. When they insist that he paints his house, he does finally paint his house by adding tons more crazy color to his house. I love the expressions of shock from Mr. Plumbean's neighbors. They don't just say, "He's gone crazy." They say, "Plumbean has popped his cork, flipped his wig, blown his stack, and dropped his stopper." These are very amusing to read out loud, not because they are particularly realistic, but because they sound good to the ear. The author is aware of the added fun of a young child reading this book and adding their observations and commentary. The humor of Mr. Plumbean's strange house builds, and the neighbors' stuffy reactions get funnier and funnier. The Orange Splot was the beginning. After a few pages of additions making the house crazier and crazier, we reach the breaking point for Mr. Plumbean's exasperated neighbors. I love the drawing of his mustachioed face peeking up from a hammock in front of his house, complete with palm trees and a pet alligator. Mr. Plumbean is based. In response to his neighbor's outrage, Mr. Plumbean responds, "My house is me, and I am it. My house is where I like to be, and it looks like all my dreams." This becomes a repeated motif for the remainder of the story and punctuates the ending, emphasizing its importance. Mr. Plumbean has learned to express himself as an individual by painting his house, and defies the demands of his peers to conform to the rest of the neighborhood. Though I do think this is a somewhat simple metaphor for individualism and creative expression, I think it works nicely in the context of this story. And I think it's a good moral for several reasons. First, Mr. Plumbean has chosen to express himself on his property. He's not painting other people's property or demanding that they change their houses to suit his whims. He has changed his house to reflect what he wants to express. His home is his castle. Books that touch on the theme of being an individual and not conforming to peer pressure or society are a dime a dozen. But what's great about this one is the individual's message is directly tied to Mr. Plumbean's private property rights. I think that helps the story of this book resonate much more than if the moral were merely be a nonconformist. I like how, when the neighbors come calling to persuade Mr. Plumbean to change his house back to the way it was, he instead persuades them to change their houses to reflect what they want as individuals. Mr. Plumbean propagates his worldview not by force, but by reasoned conversation. Eventually, one by one, the neighbors' houses begin to look crazy as well. I love how the last few pages silently show each new house filling a whole page, visually demonstrating the influence of Mr. Plumbean. It's a pause in the action which lets us soak in a variety of crazy, beautiful houses. The last page ends with the neighbors repeating Mr. Plumbean's words, but applying it to their street. This isn't just a book about people making their houses look nutty. They have accepted Mr. Plumbean's individualist outlook through conversation with him, have applied that, and the neighborhood as a whole is now a collective of individualists. They don't need to force someone to conform because they celebrate this aesthetic variety. I give it a high recommend. And I think it's a good